So we're going to start our second presentation of the day. I'm delighted to introduce Åsa Ståhl and Kristina Lindström. Åsa is a senior lecturer in the Department of Design at Linus University in northern Sweden. And Kristina Lindström is a senior lecturer in design at the School of Arts and Communication at Malmö University. A really interesting fact that I doubt they'll mention in their presentation is that they jointly defended a dissertation in 2014, which is pretty impressive. So their work has been kind of connected at the core, and their work is actually across disciplines in communication studies and interaction design. And I think what we might learn from their practice of collective futuring today is something that sort of hinges on their ethic of commitment to care and patience around the kind of questions that the environmental remediation kind of projects. So it's an exciting adventure ahead. I'll leave you both to present.
Thank you very much, Daniela. We're really grateful for being invited to this gathering. Thank you not only Daniela, but also Jorinda, Jeroen, Jort, Nikos, Viska, and everyone else who has been involved in organizing this really thrilling days, and this day particularly, Daniela. So I'm Åsa. This is Kristina.
Yeah. Does this work? Yeah. Yeah, so I'm Kristina. And so today we will talk about our work in the Unmaking studio, where we are exploring a designer role or a designer position, where we try to shift focus from futuring or future making through making new things to futuring through unmaking. And so what we mean by this will hopefully become clearer throughout the presentation, where we will discuss one of our ongoing projects in the Unmaking studio, as well as one project that led us up to setting up this studio.
And those are Plastic Imaginaries and Unmaking Soil Communities. And the projects have in common that they in different ways explore ways of caring for matters that have emerged in the aftermath of industrialized design. Our focus will also be on what is unmade through these engagements, such as material relations, practices, aesthetics, and imaginaries. And our approach can there be understood as an attempt to trouble imaginaries that has been and still are central within design. Because, you know, design as a practice and a discipline is future-oriented and primarily focused on transforming the future into a preferred one through making the new. And design's focus on what is made rather than what is replaced or left behind or becoming waste has, and we think will continue to contribute to urgent environmental concerns.
So while a lot of design and perhaps also society at large has this future orientation, there are also several calls today to turn towards the past and to notice how the past has not passed but is still ongoing, and how different past comes to matter in the present. So for example, trying to understand our contemporary times, Stephen Jackson reminds us, like every generation before, we live in the aftermath. And so what characterizes our current time, we think, is that we're living in the aftermath of industrialized design that has been developed within a modernist framework guided by anthropocentric and progressivist imaginaries. So in other words, design that has been focused on making people's, and perhaps I should also add, specific people's lives better, and to enable continuous progress through making new things.
And when we talk about imaginaries, maybe we just pause there a bit, we mean ideas that influence actions and often materialize in the form of products or new designs. And anthropocentric and progressivist imaginaries have, for example, been enacted through the use of plastics. When plastics first started to be used within industrialized design, it was there to replace other materials such as wood, clay, glass, stone, and metal. And it became an enactment of human mastery over nature and seemed to offer endless possibilities, the plasticity of plastics. And since plastics is often used in disposable products, it has also enabled a supposedly carefree living, the image there, like happy, jolly life. You just throw your stuff away after single use, without so much of a hesitation around what will happen to the plastics after the use. So very focused on the use time. In the aftermath of this way of thinking and making, we're reminded that past matter, and on a rather concrete level, with plastics, it accumulates. So, for example, you might have heard of plastics turning up in sea salt or in bodies. And then that means that the plastics that was once associated with human mastery over nature has now turned out to have unexpected and often unwanted effects. And also another pause before we move on. When we say in the aftermath of industrialized design, we don't mean that it's over, but very much still ongoing. And that's particularly noticeable in the lingering effects, like we see here in this image, and it'll continue to linger.
So, as a response to these matters that have emerged in the aftermath of previous making, there are also several calls today to rethink and rework how designers work and to break with these modernist imaginaries. So, for example, Moore points out that the philosophies, concepts, and stories we use to make sense of an increasingly explosive and uncertain global present are nearly always ideas inherited from a different time and place. And the kind of thinking that created today's global turbulence is unlikely to help us solve it. So, in other words, to respond to these matters that have emerged in the aftermath is not only a matter of attending or caring for materialities such as plastic accumulated in oceans or in bodies, but also to rethink and rework these imaginaries, or the inherited imaginaries concepts and figures that help us think and do in different ways, or to help us future in different ways.
And there are many who are helping us with this rethinking imaginaries and concepts. And for example, we turn to Anat Singh and her colleagues who propose two figures, the ghost and the monster, that invite to transdisciplinary work that in different ways break with a modernist heritage. And more particularly, ghosts and monsters are described as, and now I quote, 2 points of departure for characters, agencies, and stories that challenges the double conceit of modern man. Against the fable of progress, ghosts guide us through haunted lives and landscapes. Against the conceit of the individual, the monsters highlight symbiosis, the enfolding of bodies within bodies in every ecological niche. And that's published in the book Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet. So in other words, two figures that invite us to notice temporal, material, and conceptual entanglements, rather than discrete entities and temporalities. And then our own, just to put the ghost and the monster into our own words, with the ghost, we think of that as what we might have thought was left behind us, come haunting us. And the idea of an untouched future that we can step into is not possible then. And with the monsters, relations is what to look for. That's what should guide our observations, rather than the singular or well-delimited. And the relationships can add up to monstrous gatherings of unexpected combinations, but then we need to embrace that as well.
So we will now move on to Plastic Imaginaries. That is the project that led us up to setting up the Unmaking Studio. The project was part of a Nordic art and science network called Hybrid Matters, where we and others explored hybrid ecologies or the convergence of our environment with technologies, and also to engage with both intentional and unintentional transformations of our planet through human activities. And in our work, we primarily focused on the unintentional transformation or effects, and here we can also refer to what Anat Singh has called unintentional designs. So more specifically, we worked with two unintended hybrid matters that emerged in the aftermath of what we perhaps can call a plastic era. And so the first one is a new geological entity called plastiglomerates that consists of basalt stone, plastics, and sometimes also other kinds of materials. And the second one is common mealworms that have been shown to be able to biodegrade styrofoam. And both of these matters involve processes of transformation, but they are connected to different temporalities and materialities, and perhaps also responsibilities. So plastiglomerates comes into being through a combination of human and non-human forces, such as lava outbursts, sea currents, washing plastic debris ashore, leisure activities on the beaches, bonfires, barbecue, and weathering. But we can also imagine that the common mealworm's capacity to be able to biodegrade styrofoam has possibly emerged because of long-term co-living between humans, common mealworms, and the kind of waste we have in our kitchens. So this is something that probably have emerged through this particular relationship and what kind of waste we produce. And when we first encountered these two findings in scientific articles, we could also see how they started to circulate in blogs and social media, and how they sparked both curiosity, worry, but also hope. So whereas the plastiglomerate primarily became part of dystopian narratives, the common mealworms and their newly found capacity to be able to biodegrade plastics that previously was imagined as this material that is really, really hard to get rid of, became part of more hopeful narratives in another otherwise rather negative debate on plastic waste. So in a way, it seemed like the plastiglomerates and the common mealworms eating styrofoam were doing the work of, let's say, speculative design, in the sense that they were sparking engagement and conversations around a specific issue, so in this case, plastic waste. But they also became part of different kinds of futuring or different kinds of narratives. As I said, on the one hand, a rather dystopian, and another more hopeful, but perhaps also envisioning these worms as a kind of techno-fix that would solve this very complex problem with just these worms. Yes.
So our way of engaging with these findings and to situate them in a more specific context were to explore ways of caring for matters that emerge in the aftermath of industrialized design. We crafted a series of events. And the events were a way of bringing the spectacular into the mundane living, and to, in a way, combine the empirical with the speculative. So here you see an image from Plastiglomerate Walks in Iceland, where we and others went looking for plastiglomerates. We invited people living there, being there at the moment. It became a gathering of tourists, locals, families, artists, geologists, who went out looking for plastiglomerates. And you can see it's like a pristine environment. It was very thrilling to walk there. And as we were walking around, some responded by cleaning the beaches. during the walk. But nobody found plastiglomerates. However, this cleaning the beach from plastics became a way of almost unmaking the becoming of plastiglomerates. So it started touching upon some kind of unmaking there. Others who went along on this walk, they started making their own plastiglomerates in the sense of just composing what they found into something that looked like a geological entity, or that they could make believe was a geological entity. We also set a fire where we tried to make plastiglomerates ourselves. We used some of the found plastics and some of the basalt stones that we found there. And through this combination of activities, we could see how we engaged in speculative ways of both making and unmaking plastiglomerates. And with the other event, the domestic plastic composting, we made prototypes with what was at hand, nothing spectacular at all, just glass jars, common mealworms from a reptile store, styrofoam containers from takeaway food, and we invited people to make their own kits and to bring them home with them, to live with it for a couple of weeks. And those who gathered, again, were people who are curious, who perhaps already had something on their mind about environmental concerns and the connection to materials and practices and lives that we live, or that some live. So after the living with this domestic plastic composting kit, we gathered again to share experiences. And we discussed both making and unmaking relationships to the worms and plastics. And whereas most of the participants previously had related to the worms as pests, that's what I guess most people do, this living with had also enabled other kinds of relationships, such as sort of the realization of a multi-species labor force. Both the worms and the humans were working on taking care of the waste, but also the worms as pets and as pesto. And these relationships, of course, are in turn related to our living with plastics. So it wasn't just about our relationship to worms, but also our relationships to plastics. How much plastics do we bring home? Where does it go afterwards, and so on.
So based on these events, both of the plastiglomerate walks and the composting plastics, we crafted a speculative story called Plastic Imaginaries. The composter meets the rag picker. So in this story, we have two figures that propose different ways of living with or without plastics. And we will now listen to this story. It's about 10 minutes and also accompanied by images and illustrations. And this, the images are taken from these events, either by us or by others who participated. And the work has also been exhibited in various places with the combination of the story and different materialities. And perhaps I should also say that the book is accompanied by a companion, a Plastic Imaginaries companion, where there are manuals, guides, and recipes that are kind of based on the events. Yes.
Plastic Imaginaries by Åsa Ståhl and Kristina Lindström. The rag picker meets the composter. Dedication to the humans and non-humans who share the attraction and repulsion of plastiglomerates and plastic composting with common mealworms, who walked with us along beaches in Iceland, Finland, and Norway, who engaged in reproduction and transformation in Denmark and Sweden. Thank you for exploring hybrid matters with us. The rag picker meets the composter. What did you find, you rag picker? Can I have a look in your carrier bag? The usual stuff: plastic containers, fishing nets and wrappings from barbecue sausages, and a new one, a plastic Christmas tree, but mostly fishing industry gear and waste from leisure activities. It's got such a sea smell to it. Let's go into the kitchen. Their block of flats was once for the rich families, but when the nearby beaches became flushed with plastics, the rich ones moved on. The rag picker and the composter felt lucky to find this place to live so close to shores where the waves and currents make some of the marine plastic debris into drift material. Since the resources to produce new plastics has become scarce, the plastic drift material has become ambiguous, both pollution and a resource. On a small scale, it's a welcome addition to the household economy. On another, it's part of the sustainability discourse. There are heated debates over who has the rights to what was formerly known as plastic waste. Is it the ones who were at the point of origin, or the ones who has it in their hands right now? The lack of formalized decision has led to development that deeply challenged the right of common that has been indicative of most Nordic welfare states. For example, remote beaches in northern Iceland and Norway, where huge amounts of plastic debris from afar is washed ashore, have been fenced off, preventing the general public to go there to collect plastic pieces for private use. Instead, big corporations harvest this resource to produce lightweight products where the preferred material is plastic. Look at this beauty. It's got shimmering stones and a toothbrush almost in disguise. I think I want to keep it as it is. Yet another plasticlomerate. You're in love with the aesthetics of your rag. I thought you were going to contribute to our emergency supply and that the rest would be sold off for the common good. Not everyone has a beach like ours nearby. And you know how the plastic dependency and the scarce resources don't go well together. Have you seen that other rag pickers start bonfires on the beach to make plastiglomerates intentionally? I hear they are making jewelry out of them. I wouldn't be caught dead wearing one of those. It's like wearing mink fur. Yes, it's such a waste, but still so beautiful and mysterious. They make me think of lost visions. Their windowsill is full of plastiglomerates that the rag picker has deemed beauties. Sometimes discrete objects and products can be deciphered. Sometimes how the objects fit into old forms of life can be imagined. What plastiglomerates have in common is that due to wasting, currents, weathering, pressure, and fires, they've become something new, a hybrid matter of stones and plastics and corals and sand and more. Their basement is full of cubes of melted plastics. Like the plastiglomerates, previous objects and practices can only be imagined. Plastic forks, fishing nets, plastic bottles, all kinds of things have merged and become plastic reservoirs. Since newly produced plastics has become scarce, the government has suggested that each household have a 3D printer and at least 1 square meter of plastics at home for emergencies. The recovered plastic is often used to make everyday use objects, such as covers for mobile phones and various spare parts to enable repair of domestic technologies. For how long are you going to do this rag picking? As long as there is plastics washing ashore on the beaches, as long as we need plastics, as long as I have access to the beaches. Can I have this piece of styrofoam? What for? I want to try something more transformative. What do you mean? I found some common mealworms in our jar of oats the other day. From what I understand, they like to eat what we eat, but also what we throw away. And I wanted to truly challenge our dependency on plastics and let them compost some styrofoam. That's radical, but okay. You go ahead and take that small piece, but do keep it small, please. And don't let the worms spread in the apartment. It should be safe. I repurposed this jar that I found them in. I was inspired by the aesthetics of the kitchen practice of keeping things out. Now I use the jar to keep them in. Kind of funny. A biologist noticed some holes in his plastic trash bag. In the bag, he also found common mealworms that seemed to have eaten the plastics. It turned out that common mealworms that are usually fond of living with humans and feast off the things that are kept in cupboards can biodegrade styrofoam. A scientific article showing the use of a species can thus turn a pest into a labor force. The scientists have indicated that they want to bioengineer the enzyme of the common mealworms so they can become an even more efficient labor force. Others have speculated on transferring the enzyme to humans. Look, ragpicker, small holes are starting to emerge in the miso soup cup you had a takeaway in the other week. You can even hear the sound of them chewing. How long will it take until they're done with it? A week? A month? A year? And it smells. Yes, I think I gave them too much cucumber yesterday. It became such a mess. I'm still trying to figure out how to care for them. It's too cold and rainy to have them outdoors in the yard. They seem to like it here in our kitchen. They always have. Well, come to think of it, I'm less concerned about the smell. The rag always smells fishy, and I've gotten used to that. I'd say that the CO2 emissions are more of an issue. Imagine if these grubs are working for us on a large scale. Yeah, and imagine if the superworms escaped. We've made ourselves so dependent on plastics that I'm not sure we can cope with that kind of pest. Actually, I think the insulation of our house is styrofoam. I guess, as a rag picker, I'm mainly wondering if composting plastics would mean that we will get rid of plastics altogether. Why should we get rid of plastics when it has become such a scarce material? What kinds of lives can we live without plastics? Would we be able to live lives as we know them here if there was no plastics at all? Recently, composting communities have emerged that argue that it should be compulsory to not only do waste sorting, but also for every household to have a compost for domestic plastic waste. One of the arguments was that it was no longer viable for consumers to live with materials only during use time. Rather, consumers of plastic products that were not mendable or possible to repair, like most of it, had to take care of and show responsibility for what they had contributed to bringing into the world. Entrepreneurs have liaised themselves with these communities, but instead of the distributed and domestic composting, they have argued for the benefits of more industrial composting, which would relieve the households from burdens of labor and care. Professionals would do that job instead. Speaking of transformation, I think the worms will turn into beetles soon, so I'm thinking of making spring rolls with crunchy mealworms later today. I don't want them to go to waste. That's a big step for me. I'm a foodie too, but I prefer clean food. The point is that the worms do biodegrade the plastics. It's clean. I've sprinkled the feces on the herbs out on the balcony. I wish you would have told me. That seems a bit reckless. I'm sorry to break the news, but we're probably eating plastics already anyway. I've recently read that since there's so much plastic debris in the ocean, there is apparently plastic in sea salt nowadays. Who knows? Perhaps we will also be able to biodegrade plastics. We? As in humans? Yes, why not? I guess the worms haven't always been able to do this, but developed this skill as they've been living alongside humans and the plastic waste we produce. The flatmates live in the aftermath of a plastic era, where the lines separating nature and culture no longer seem viable. Instead, strange and perhaps unexpected socio-material entanglements such as plastic stones and plastic munching worms speak up and question how we can continue to live with or without plastics. The rag picker and the composter have found different ways of caring for the situation at hand. The rag picker walks along the beaches, where currents wash plastic debris ashore to collect and recycle. The composter is looking for something more transformative, but such a transformation requires work, not only from the composter and those who are dependent on plastics, but from a multi-species labor force. These emerging practices of rag picking and composting offer partial, situated, makeshift responses to the issues that are co-articulated with the changing matters at hand. As the matters at hand continuously shift, so will issues and practices.
So while unmaking wasn't our main concern when working with this project, Plastic Imaginaries, it became central to this project and also inspired us in setting up the unmaking studio that we have now gotten. It's financed by the Swedish Research Council for Artistic Research. And we'll now move on to one of our ongoing projects within the unmaking studio, where we continue to explore a designer role or a designer position that tries to shift from futuring through making to futuring through un/making.
So in Plastic Imaginaries, we situated ourselves in the aftermath of the plastic era. In unmaking soil communities, we moved into the aftermath of glass production in Småland, Sweden, southern Sweden, an area also called the Kingdom of Crystal. And that's where booming glass design industry and design production took place during the 1900s. The landscape gave stone to grind for sand for the glass, and water for hydropower, and forests to heat up the ovens with. It also gave avant-garde, in the Kingdom of Crystal, avant-garde modernist design, aesthetics, products and practices connected to those products emerged, and they influenced not only Swedish lives but also lives elsewhere because it was exported. And now most of the production has left this area. There's not a lot of glass production taking place anymore, and when there is, they're done within different parameters than during most of the 1900s. But what it has left in the aftermath is polluted soil, metals from the making of the shimmering and mesmerizing glass products, metals such as lead, cadmium, arsenic, copper. There is an awareness of this issue that the soil is polluted. It's actually an awareness on all kinds of institutional levels, but it's debated how it matters, for whom, as well as how to care for it.
So instead of continuing to explore the figure of the rag picker and the composter, we here took on the figure of undisciplined daughters of Linnaeus. And there is a lot to say about Carl von Linné, but I'll keep it short here. So Carl Linnaeus was a Swedish scholar who grew up in this area in the 1700s, and he also traveled to a lot of places, but also in this region, where he tried to order the world and gave us the categories of animals, plants, and minerals. And these are categories that are still used today. But as undisciplined daughters of Linnaeus, we built on the legacy of his practices, and but instead we have directed our curiosity towards hybrids and nature-culture relationships rather than these rather strict categories.
We went to the Kingdom of Crystal and brought an invitation asking what places is in need of care. We also brought a speculative proposal of planting a seed. We had chosen seeds that can do many things, including phytoremediation. And phytoremediation is a way of using plants' capacity to accumulate metals, pull metals up with their roots. And phytoremediation is then a way of letting plants clean polluted soil. But those plants can do more than that. I mean, you see, perhaps you know Latins, you know their or you know Swedish, but they're more than just phytoremediators. They can also be edible, beautiful, and invasive. And the seed bags emphasize the roots because that's where most of the work is done. We've also put down the metals that they can accumulate. So arsenic is obvious, lead, cadmium, nickel, copper, quicksilver. Yeah, I think that zinc.
So we went visiting this region with this invitation and with these seeds, and we were shown a lot of different locations that were in need of care, and we also met a lot of curiosity towards this proposal. However, so far, this invitation and the proposal to remediate the soil through plants is primarily a speculative proposal. So we haven't actually carried it out. And this is partly due to temporalities of season. So while we traveled, it was autumn. But also various risks and uncertainties in terms of which soil was actually polluted and with what. And how and if these plants would actually do the work of remediating the soil. How to care for the plants while growing, or if the plants actually would also have harmful effects, such as, for example, the lupin is categorized as an invasive species in Sweden, and also if the plants accumulate heavy metals and they are all edible, that also introduces risks both for animals and humans. But there are also uncertainties in relation to how to actually care for the plants if they accumulate any metals. Then you need to harvest it and somehow care for it. And those infrastructures are not in place. So we had some hesitation towards this invitation ourselves, and also through the encounters with others that we met. So in January, we were invited to be part of an exhibition in Växjö, at Växjö Art Gallery, that is close to this region. And the exhibition was called Multi-Species Storytelling. So in setting up this exhibition, based on this work so far, it became important for us to share the work with all of these uncertainties and limitations and risks, as well as to expand. Perhaps we can also think of it as an expansion of the invitation to gain more knowledge. And so we will now move on to some of one part of this exhibition was that we had set up a notice board with a series of notes, partly aligning ourselves with Linnaeus' practice of note-taking. And also we'll read parts of those notes before we move on.
So it turns into this bedtime story session. See if you fall asleep. Uprooted. The tree throw, an uprooted tree, is a site for discovery. The past comes to the surface. At the same time, a tree throw can act as an interference in the work of trying to know or understand the past as a linear story. The record of time, stored in the layers of soil, becomes unsettled. If we try to listen to a tree throw, we don't get a story with distinct and separated time periods, but an invitation to imagine how still ongoing pasts can come to matter in the present. The humus-poor but mineral-rich soil is laid bare. Over time, leaves, water, and other organic materials gather with decomposers, soil communities in the making. Soil communities. As undisciplined daughters of Linnaeus, we direct our curiosity towards nature-culture relationships, or soil communities in the kingdom of crystal. We go visiting with concepts and ways of knowing that are partly aligned with, but also break with the legacy of Linnaeus. We're not trained to keep things straight or separated, but to notice and engage with relations, interdependencies, and entanglements. Within the natural sciences, soil communities are most often thought of as organisms in the soil. Humans rarely figure in the understanding of soil communities, and if they do, they are often there as harmful intruders or victims of pollution. However, there are other ways of imagining these relationships. Rather than understanding humans as disrupting soil ecologies or as victims of pollution, Puig de la Bella Casa invites us to consider humans as members of soil communities, Soil as nature-culture relationships that become over time with what is at hand. Take root. From noticing the uprooted, we traveled onwards with bags full of seeds that could take root and form part of new relationships. The way the seeds are named are reminiscents of Linnaeus, Helianthus annus, Glycine max. A common denominator to the seeds we've chosen is that they, through their roots, can accumulate metals and thereby remedy soil that has been polluted by the industrial production. But the plants we've chosen have the possibilities to do more than that. They can be aesthetically pleasing, they can be invasive, they can nourish soil, they can be a source of protein for humans seeking to diminish their environmental impact. With this multiplicity in mind, we proceed with caution and care for both risks and potentialities. And we ask others for help in unmaking soil communities. How to proceed, with whom, where, and when.
So these notes end by this question of how to proceed, and in the exhibition space we pointed towards several possibilities of how to proceed. So for example, here is the wall, and there you also see the notes that are combined with images and drawings. But on the right side of the notice board you also see a tool for making soil samples. So one way of proceeding would then be, or we invited people to take soil samples, and we had a workshop where we scanned. And right on the right side of the tool for taking soil samples, there is a calendar that points towards different phases of a possible future work on unmaking soil communities, such as planning, planting, cultivating, caring, harvesting, and so on. But exactly how that will work, if it will work, or if we will still hesitate too much, is something that we're working together with people in the area at the moment. So, as I mentioned, another possibility that is also central to the overall invitation is to potentially care about the soil through plants, and this was also something that we materialized and explored in the exhibition space. So we planted the different seeds in these glass balls that were made in a newly opened local glass furnace in the area. And so through trying this out in this very kind of constrained shape and connecting it both to the past, or how the past is lingering in the soil, but also to this present glass industry, we try to make connections both between the past, the present, and the future, but also show or make present the various risks, uncertainties, and limitations of this proposal. And the plants that are just very tiny here have now been sent off to a lab where they will be tested to see if they actually manage to accumulate any metals.
So as Kristina mentioned, we've done one session of soil scanning in the art gallery itself, but now the Unmaking Studio has moved out of the art gallery, and we're planning another soil scanning session in the Kingdom of Crystal itself to get to change locations and get closer to the actual living with this soil. So we're inviting the ones living there in their everyday mundane lives. We're gonna, so there's a connection with cleaning again. We're gonna connect with a day of cleaning the streets, I guess, in a particular society in a couple of weeks, where we'll do soil scanning together with the environmental scientists. And depending on the response to the soil scanning, we might continue to plant seeds together with people who we've worked with, who we've visited and met. But it might also be that we find it too risky For example, how to understand the data that's generated through this scanning. We've already had instances where it shows very high levels of arsenic. And what does it mean? How to act on it? There's not a given response. Should we plant a seed or pull an emergency brake? What institutional level can actually act on this? Do we have to act on all kinds of institutional levels and mundane non-institutional levels? These are questions that we're struggling with and trying to find answers with both scientists and the ones living there.
So, taken together, we have in this presentation explored and discussed different figures. So, the rag picker, the composter, and the unfaithful daughters of Linnaeus. And they all make use of different practices. So, obviously, composting, rag picking, noticing, visiting, growing, and phytoremediating. And these are all practices for caring for matters that have emerged in the aftermath. Which involves both making and unmaking of material relations and also imaginaries. So we bring these figures as possible actors to be part of futuring, and futuring that has the commitment to care for still ongoing pasts, or what Tsing et al. Have called ghosts. And they also share a curiosity towards nature-culture relationships, or hybrids, or perhaps what Tsing et al. Have called monsters. So in other words, these figures do in different ways break with, or perhaps even unmake, some of the modernist imaginaries that has been and still is strong within design. So here I'm referring to the future orientation as well as the dualistic thinking. So with this approach, we're hoping to draw attention to hybrids, and still ongoing past. However, it should be acknowledged that both hybrids and ongoing pasts might involve contradiction, conflicts that are really difficult to solve, or that will never be possible to completely resolve. So we do not propose these figures as solutions, but rather as ongoing practices of care. And that these also need to be adjusted to different contexts and situations. So, to situate these practices. And as a final note, we would also like to revisit the quote by Moore that we used in the beginning, where he suggests that we are not likely to be able to solve or address issues that we have at hand today with concepts and practices that we have inherited from the past. And this is then because these ways of thinking and doing have also been part of creating some of these problems. But in our attempts to unmake or find alternatives to these ways of thinking and doing, we have not tried to invent something completely new, but rather perhaps we can think of it as also as a process of reviving practices such as composting and rag picking. These are obviously not new things, but rather something that we can bring back or revive. But important to be aware of in such a process is also to acknowledge that they need to be adjusted and changed. As matters in the compost pile or in the soil might change, we also need to rethink what composting means, or what growing means, and what rag picking means. Yeah,
Thank you.